New year. Obviously, it's a few days past, but welcome to the 2025 edition of our historical lectures. My name is Carl Kriesman. I am a professor of history at Valencia College on the East Campus. I'm the chair of the division on what we do there, and it's been my pleasure since 2017 to work with the library in a variety of historical talks, starting that year with what was then the centennial of the United States entry into World War I. And then since that time, we've expanded. And I thought that'd be actually a good place to start. This is the series we call Citizen Civics. So why do we have this series? The other series is called Past Meets Present, and it's a variety of historical topics. This year, two of those topics we're partnering with the library is doing a year of Jane Austen, if you don't know. In fact, there's dancing, I believe, happening upstairs. Don't leave. But if you really want to go dance, please go. And it's on the website. A lot of wonderful things happening, and I'll show you at the end. But I believe it's the June book we're doing is connected to Napoleon, and so we're doing the Battle of Waterloo. And then later in the year, actually the April book, we are going to come back to it in Past Meets Present and talk about it and look at the issue of British imperialism and the anti-slavery movement that came out of its imperialism. So we're going to talk about those things and connect. We've got a couple other talks. But this series, we started it in 2021. And it's connected to what we're going to be really looking at, particularly this year, although I would say we've done it, in a sense, what I'm going to explain to you throughout all three. So this is the fourth year of us doing this. And so the why we're doing this topic today kind of is connected to kind of how we got into this idea. And obviously, well, maybe not obviously, that's the reason I want to explain it to you. In 2021, while we were in lockdown still, the library reached out and said, hey, we are going to start doing lectures in 22. We had an idea for a series. Clearly, that was connected to the rising tensions that had been growing, probably most specifically coming on January 6th at that inauguration at that time of President Biden. And many people, including myself, felt a lot of distress at those events. For many people, I think that was the kind of wake-up moment to say, wow, something going on in the society. What's interesting is that if you know your world history, we should not have necessarily felt distress. Or the question is, well, why do we feel distressed? Were we distressed at the event or that the event happened? Those are two different things. And I would argue we were more distressed that it happened than the event. And that it happened, for myself, you don't have to agree with me, of course, is an expression of a sense that was perhaps subconscious for many people that such couldn't happen here. But of course, if you know your world history, it happens all the time. It's a normal thing for the human. And in fact, if you think about it, you know our history, you go, well, yeah, actually, it's part of our DNA. It's kind of how we started. And so the point of us doing Citizen Civics then is to speak into, well, what do we think is so necessarily special or worthy of what we have set up as a civic structure so that we might think, well, it couldn't happen here. Does that make sense, kind of where we're going? It's interesting that this happened in 22. We started the series in 22 because I didn't know when we started, but later that year, I was going to begin a 3-year process that is coming to an end for me, obviously, 3 years, on a doctorate, on a new degree for myself. And long story short, the product of that work was not what I probably would have preferred, just try to write a dissertation that probably would sit on a shelf somewhere that nobody would read, but instead they asked me to do a podcast. And so this podcast is the output of that work, but the focus of the work, in one sense, goes hand in glove with the topic that I'm going to talk about, Citizen Civics. If you've been in any of the lectures that I've done at various times, you may have garnered the fact that for me, there are aspects of where we have arrived as a society that I see in sort of a historical position that are problematic or concerning to myself. And so I've talked before about how I am a supporter or a believer in the cycles of history, and that in Anglo-American history there is, now almost a 600-year pattern that one can trace through the events of history that then lay out that this kind of sense of a crisis or an explosion coming isn't unique. So this year, at not all the moments, I just told you we're going to do Waterloo and some other moments that we're going to talk about, but this year at various moments, particularly with the Citizen Civics, my research is kind of undergirding kind of what we're going to talk about. And I think this is actually next month, we're going to look at the Enlightenment. What is the Enlightenment and how did that play a role for us, and what questions can we ask about the Enlightenment? Later in the year, we're going to dig into the Constitution, both in a sense of what were they thinking about, but then functionally what is actually written there. We're just going to break it down and look at the articles. We're going to talk about what happened in 1776, and we talked about it before. We'll really dig into what lessons can we learn from it in order. I'll put my cards on the table. My attempt, my hope is to try to provide some sort of a positive steps for us, obviously not at the national level, but in a sense to the nation, to say, we want to save this thing. And again, just to point it out to you, if you're going, well, are you sure? If you're not sure, and if you think by in terms of the things that happened in 21, that this is all connected to a certain individual or recent events, no, this is a longer sense of unraveling, which is actually the third phase of the series. And so even as far as 2000, we began to have real sense, even in President Clinton's term, of a real battle with ourselves, which people began to really be worried about. And if you remember, there'd be a lot of times during national elections and even gubernatorial elections where people would say things like, well, I'm a uniter. And the only reason you would say you're a uniter is if you perceived that there was a division you were trying to solve. It all makes logical sense. And in fact, I would go ahead and say every president elected up to this moment made that claim. You might feel like one of them was obviously lying, and that's your right to say that. But in other words, the fact that they consistently were saying this refrain is evidence to my point of why I was kind of focused on it. And then, of course, all hell broke loose, which we'll all remember. You were all here. You all went through it just like I did. And so all these things, this is not new history here. This is just very, very recent history. And all these things happen. It is, for me, the pandemic and the coming of the year 2020. When we get to the year, say, 2725, the historians will look back and target that year, much like we target other crucial years when we say, hey, what happened? Oh, well, in 1860, Lincoln was elected, and then in December and January of 61, the country went its separate ways and then rolled into what we call the Civil War. We look at those specific moments, we say, that's the trigger moment, that's the thing that happened. Now, because we're living in it, I could be wrong, and that's fine. But nonetheless, as you can understand, things began to unravel, and then as you may remember, things got worse over the whole year into. I decided as a historian, I'd do these weird things. I would keep a journal, and so for over 700 days, every day, I sat on my computer and wrote down things that happened, and sometimes my thoughts about them, and sometimes just boring things, and I always scour the world news, and so I watch a German news station, and I watch a British news station, and I watch one in from Singapore, and I just try to hear what people are saying and want to keep up with it. So all these things happen. Again, this is not to discuss with you what these things were, because you lived through them. But it is to say that as we went over this year, clearly attention had reached a tipping point that is kind of brings us into this sense of this crisis. So again, back to the library saying, hey, maybe we need to talk about what our civics is or should be. And so they gave me the task. I partnered with some of my peers. When I said the Great Crisis, just in case you don't remember that conversation at different times, which is fine, Strauss and Howe would be the best ones for you to go to. Their book Generations, which was I think in 96 or 95. And then their follow-up book called Fourth Turning would be wonderful books for you to read. They're not the only ones from historians who talk about the sense of pattern, but in general, their pattern is this kind of a sense that we go through in roughly 80 years, it's 80-ish years, a series of movements from a previous crisis into a golden age, then it unravels and goes to another crisis. For me, the easiest way to understand it is by the seasons. Although we live in Florida, so we don't technically have any seasons here, not really. But if you know the seasons, spring comes and things bud, yay! And then summer's the flowering, it's amazing! And then fall, things begin to die. And the poor leaves fall off to their deaths. And we love the colors while they're dying. And then in winter, it's just dead, everything's dead. Again, we don't experience that here. When I moved here the first time, I was raking leaves in March, and it was still green on the tree. I'm like going, where am I? I'm used to it now. But anyway, you know how the seasons normally work in most places, right? So this crisis, since this is, again, we've done a talk on this. If you go, I'll show you a link to my website. The first link I showed you, if you go there, you can find my YouTube and you can find this. But we've done a talk here. Maybe we'll do one in the future of what this great crisis concept is. That's not our point today. But it is just to say kind of the idea of us looking at Citizen Civics and the work of like my research work that we're going to be doing some of our work on kind of stands on that we're in this moment. And again, what I called it, as you know, is this sense of being unmoored. So society's in peril. If a boat's unmoored and is not being captained, and it's just at sea, the boat and anybody in the boat is in peril. So that you don't have to agree with me. You may not think it's in peril, but nonetheless. And so just so you can see it kind of historically worked out. This is a terrible slide, and that's my fault. This is all backed up. That says Reformation. That says colonial age. That says Revolutionary age. That says Civil War age. And this says Great Power age. This takes us up to the end of the last period, which is in the 1940s. So again, it's 80-ish years. You can do the math. 1943 plus 80 would be 2023. Thank you. Somebody's listening. Or if you back up, when the war started for us, 41. So 41 plus 80 is. So I can go back to the slide showing you all the crap going down in 21, but I don't need to because you're like, oh man. Even if you go back to 1929 when the Depression starts, when this one, depends on who you ask, would say this is the beginning. So 29 plus 80s, 2009. Remember that? We had some good things, President Obama's election, but nonetheless, it wasn't really a great time if you remember. Got a lot of stuff going on. So, we'll get more detailed as we go forward in time, long after I'm dead. Historians will be able to look back and get more specific. But in general terms, you and I can say, hey, stuff is going on. Now, one of the most important parts of this is when you look at the Great Crisis, what you see is that what really kicks things off is not a specific thing like an anger about the Great Depression or even an anger about slavery, but a philosophical thing. And so you can trace this. So there's a philosophical debate kind of going along. And as I mentioned a moment ago with some of our recent, say, past 25 years presidential candidates, people want there to be uniting. They'll cry out for compromise or tolerance. It never happens. There is an inexorable move in the directions of the sense of whatever the philosophical debate is, which most often at its core is a question of what would be the best civic society. Again, back to this idea of citizen civics in the process. So anyway, back to Unmoored, that's where I was. And what was I trying to do here? So my short version is that we are adrift, and that comes from the fact that we have lost understanding of our national history. So of course, as a historian, you might say, well, of course you would say that, but that's the research thing. And when you study, it's so interesting when you study a lot of ancient texts and you look at societies that also have collapsed or declined, you'll hear this, that their own writers and thinkers of the time are saying to their own people, we have forgotten. So, and I love the library's support for the idea of even studying on the past meets present topics, which are just random and one-offs and things we've talked about and things we look at. It is, again, to remind ourselves, wait, what really did happen and how does it go down and how do we look at that? And then if you ever listen to the podcast, that's really the focus. I bring up a whole host of primary sources and we read them together and we look at them. It's not meant to be, here's Carl's opinion, but to say, well, what did the source actually say? And so then my effort is to try to address that, which again is just helping you kind of understand the point of where we are. Now you may think, I don't know that things are as bad. I mean, yes, maybe you would say because of a certain figure or a certain political group that you think they've caused some problems, but then you might then think if we could maybe eliminate them or they were no longer making noise, then that somehow would eliminate the problem. And I would suggest that is not the case. And when you look at just any cursory glance at our nation, and then you compare it back, all of a sudden you begin to say, well, wait a minute, I'm concerned. So, this is, after World War II, this was us by almost any reckoning of world observation. You might have argued it was a little bit us beforehand, but nonetheless. Now, it's really important to me that you understand that this listing of things or this concept of the country as either unique or having some aspects that are that are even special is not some sort of triumphalistic idea. That the country has not and ever will be, I think, be perfect. One, because I'm here now, so I'm here. It's going to be kind of screwy at different times. It's not necessarily good. There certainly are things we can go back and we do, and we have my lectures in here and in my classroom, and point out the things that, at least from a current modern day point of view, I find troubling, or I don't like, or it makes me disappointed that they did that thing. And I'm allowed to stand in my year and look back and say, I don't think that was good. I have to be careful not to judge them for things that they might not have known or held in common at that time, because if they're unknown, then they can't have known it, even if we may wish that they would have known it. But even if I think, no, they knew it and they did it anyway, and I then think that's not good, I still can step back, and this is kind of what I teach at the college, is really on a kind of a massive scale, from ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia all the way to the modern day events. So I get the privilege of sort of being on the space shuttle and seeing the planet as a whole as we go around and talk about the different things. And when you look at the United States as an entity and you compare it to the variety of things that have been out there throughout our human history, it's easily in the top 1% of places to live. And you know this if for no other reason than from the moment the country existed, everybody's wanted to move here. And by and large, nobody ever leaves. And they don't leave because they can't leave. And certainly today, over the past 40 years, if you wanted to leave, you and I both know you can do that pretty darn easily. You just take off. Ain't nobody stopping you nowhere, and go find another place to live. There's lots of great places. They all have air conditioning, electricity, and the internet, so nothing's stopping you, but nobody ever leaves. We moan a lot at times, I certainly do, but we don't leave. And again, that's not, I don't mean that as a silly thing or as a panacea for us to just ignore ills from the past or even ills of the present. I'm not saying that, but I am saying we want to look at it fairly when we're examining. As I'm suggesting to you, as we will look further today, that there's some unique aspects that we should cherish and hold on to if we wish to preserve. I want to make sure you're really clear that I'm at least aware of, that we have some ills. Now, you might say, well, why are you so animated about all this? Well, I'm animated because my students, and for the past 15 years at least, my students have at various times told me versions of, I feel a sense of hopelessness. I feel a sense of there may not be a good reason to try hard. I'm constantly talking to my students about, you got to work harder, you got to push yourself, you got to go forward. And there's things I might say or think about their training as children in the K-12 system, but I'm trying to push them and they don't like it. And there's things I could say about that. But when they say to me, I'm not sure there's a reason for trying, that troubles me. And if you think it's just my students, you don't have to look that far to understand there's a whole bunch of stuff that has exploded on us in, again, the last, say, 20 to 30 years. You know these things. I'm not going to belabor the point, kind of digging into them. And when you look at the emotional distress, that's one of the worst things. It's overwhelming, the emotional distress that the country's been in, particularly when you look at things like suicide. Most societies, most of the time, with most age groups, do not perceive their best solution is to end their own life. Now, we've always had suicide. Often, when you find within a society a generational block who feels maybe more wishing it was over for them, it's old people like me, where you can sort of see the end already. You've already lived through 2 or 3 laps, and you don't want to go necessarily, but there's sometimes you may look at things and feel like you wish you could go. Older people are not shocked by the kind of Dr. Kevorkings of the world and that ideology. When you get here, you're like, oh yeah, I get it. Our problem, or our setting for the past 15 years, is that that's not happening for our older generation. I mean, it happens a little bit. It's happening amongst the young. And as citizens who would wish the society to continue, we should say, well, that's not good, because we need citizens to be here, and if all the young citizens want to kill themselves, well, that's problematic. And that should concern us. And so again, this is me both giving you evidence, but also explaining kind of my passion into kind of why I'm digging into it. And the metrics back all this up. I mean, it is not good where the country is. And again, if you set this in context against where we were, say, circa 1950, again, pausing, I am not saying 1950 was some amazing, the best time to be alive, we should all go back to that. Not in a heartbeat. But just comparatively, data points, you go, oh wow, something has happened to us. And so then that should raise the question within us as to what has happened. Now, again, my general point, I've already told you, we've lost touch with our history, and so then that's led us down some roads. There's a lot more of that to go into. I do on the podcast. I'm not doing it here today, but it kind of could concern us as a people if we want what we do to continue. And let me just stop. That really is the central question. If you walk away with anything today, I'd love you to walk away with that. Do I want the system that we call the United States to continue? By the way, you're totally on fair ground with me to go, yeah, no, I wish it was over. Groovy. I would probably follow that up with, can you tell me what you'd like to replace it with? Because that's fair. You should be able to tell me what you want to replace it with. But what we can't do, and what I think we have done, is assume that of course it will continue. Because what history tells us is not a chance. Particularly the type of system we've set in motion. That's a different conversation. I may come back to that later. But if you say, I don't care, then leave now or don't listen to the podcast because it doesn't make sense to you. I believe in my fellow citizens of all stripes, beliefs, philosophies, that they actually do want it to continue. They want it to keep working. That at some level, even if they don't even have children yet, there's a sense in which they would prefer this be here for future grandchildren. In that case, we need to be aware that, well, something's happened. And this is not, just so you know, today and or with the podcast, this is not a certain person has done something or a certain group has done something or a specific ideology or a specific political party. We're all in. And so then I think there's a sense in which we should say to ourselves, oh, okay, well, oh, wow, all right. So, again, just pointing out, we got issues. We're not going to spend any more time here. And again, we have our own division, right? So say immigration, well, you're going to get two different answers at least. If you say national defense, you're going to get 2 or 3 different answers. These are things I've heard people say, right? So when I say we're philosophically divided, I want you may have got that one already. You're like, yeah, I know what you're saying, Carl. But again, here's that point. We have these issues, but we don't seem to have a clue or a united idea of how to approach them. Okay, we're going to go there. I think that these 6 issues are central, and we're not going to belabor them today, but I just want you to say, if you think, well, Carl, why do you think it's happened beyond the fact of loss of our history? It's here. And so then this sets up some of the key things, because if we want to preserve our system, all of these are an antithesis or an anathema to our system. And they are all kind of, in one sense, sort of linked, and there's a connection to us having arrived at that pinnacle of success in 1950. And I just said 50, meaning post-World War II, better way of saying it. So having arrived at that pinnacle of success, it has, to some degree, become an undoing of who we are. And again, the first clue, we all know this from AA, the first clue is to admit there's a problem. And so that's what I'm kind of asking us to do. And for me then, our central issue is that for the first time in these philosophical debates that I've showed you, it's not only that we're debating a foundational question about our civic government, but that for the first time we're debating our foundation in general. That for the first time it's our worldview that is in dispute. And this connects to something that we're all afraid of. You'll all be nervous when I say it, and that is that our issue is a spiritual issue. And again, circa 1950 to now, although I would suggest this has been true for a longer time, we're all uncomfortable when somebody wants to talk about spirituality, religion, faith, that kind of a thing. Set your minds at ease. I'm not planning on giving you a defense of some religion or suggest to you, let me explain some religion here, that kind of a thing. That's not our focus. But when you say, what philosophically has led us to a place where particularly our younger generation wants to just go ahead and push all the chips in and end it. And you have these deeper questions that are dividing us on various points that are not connected to a political party. What I would say is, I'm going to show you hopefully today, our system is founded on an idea that demands a moral virtue foundation. You cannot do our system without a moral virtue foundation that is uniformly agreed to. And so that's our debate as a nation. And so what we have to figure out is, back to my question a minute ago, do I even want to preserve the civic system and the entity called the United States? And if I do, then we have to try to find a way to solve this problem in our situation. So what I need to prove to you today, and then we're going to be talking again through the whole year at one level, and one since we've been talking about it already, you just didn't know it, but we're talking about it, are these things. That it was unique at formation. I probably needed to say unique at formation, meaning at the 1770s. Because when we've been in here before, and some of you have been here when I've done lectures about antiquity, you know there was a similar system in Rome and a similar system in Athens. So unique, that's why I put the phrase at formation, okay? And again, unique, not perfect. I'm not saying that, so don't go down that road. This connects, again, we'll talk about next, I think it is next month. I'll have the slide of the things at the end, all the different topics for the next 3 or 4 months. Connects to the Enlightenment. However, I'll just add that the Enlightenment and the functional belief in the Enlightenment has misled us, but I'll save that for then. And so hopefully you'll come back next month and we'll talk about it in the process. But it is important for us to see how we are connected to that kind of idea of enlightenment of the human. And that, of course, is a Renaissance concept. And then, again, you have to have a unanimity of the worldview, all right? Of the worldview, not of a religion or a religious faith. So here's a way for me to kind of start us in on that aspect. The Declaration says, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Now, what truth is he talking about? Well, if you read it, he's got it spelled out. It starts with the word that every time. So he says all these things. That all men are created equal. Or that to secure rights governments are instituted. All these things here in that opening paragraph. It's my contention that if you take Doc Brown's DeLorean and land all over the planet and ask them, hey, are these self-evident to you? They would have no idea what you're talking about. So we said these things should be so obvious on their face they don't need to be explained. That's the whole point. It's being self-evident. In fact, the rest of the document didn't even need to be written if we're going to say they're really self-evident. But we're saying they're self-evident, and the rest of the planet, including our relatives in Britain, would have been like, I'm not sure what you're talking about. So now, to defend Jefferson, and you've been here before, you know I don't do that often. To defend Jefferson, it wasn't Jefferson, it was Franklin. So Jefferson's the draftsman. Don't call him the author of the Declaration. But he's the draftsman. He wrote the first draft like a good freshman. Then he took it to the seniors, John Adams and Ben Franklin, and said, what do you think? And they cleaned it up a little bit. And it was Franklin who said, your statement, Tom, we hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable. It's okay, but it's a little wordy. Let's change that bad boy and say self-evident. Okay, groovy. Thanks. Good, got it. So let's blame Ben. Ben, John, Tom, they all sign off on it. There's those 2 other dudes nobody ever talks about, Roger and Robert. They don't ever get nothing. They're not there. They're like the sophomores that nobody asks what they think. The freshmen wrote the draft. They seemed pretty smart, and the 2 seniors cleaned it up, and they took it to the classroom. What do you think? And they liked it. They passed it eventually, as you know. Now, why wouldn't they know? Well, that's because when you look at world history, what you see is one consistent form of government. I'll show you a slide in a second. You've been here before. You already know the slide. You've seen it. There's one consistent form or type or style. Now, yes, in the Netherlands, in Switzerland, and in the Italian peninsula, you could find some small places that were also playing around with this type of government. So to be fair, and I didn't say nobody understood it, but most people would not have understood it. For the rest of Europe, things look like this. When you study human history, no matter which continent you go to, no matter which time period you go to, no matter which tribe you look at, which people group, whatever their skin color, this is what you find. What I call the power pyramid, just keep it simple. But a pyramid of power in which the vast majority of people have zero input. In almost all places, you'd be wrong to use the phrase citizen. They were just inhabitants. They were just part of the tribe. In a small enough tribe, they might have been family members, but nonetheless, nobody's asking for their input. The decision making is all made at the top. There might have been a small middle layer of advisors. We have different phrases for these. And again, at this level, we can say things like empire, kingdom, dictatorship, king, whatever term you want to use. These are all synonyms. They mean a civic entity, and it's for specific people in a geographically constrained place. It's a specific place. When you land in Doc Brown's DeLorean, you get out, you go, where am I? They say you're here, but you're not there. It's very clear to these people. So you can look back through history. And this would have been what was going on throughout all of Europe and all the world. It's not true today. This is why this is a challenging talk for us. Challenging in seeing that it needed to be said. That's a better way to put it. Not challenging in believing me. But, it's like, well, yeah, we have some unique things. So people go, well, no, we don't. And you look around the planet today, and depending on who's counting, 150 to 180 other nations have copied us. And we're glad for that. And we are happy. And we argue about whether they really are doing it the way we would do it. And then people would argue whether we're still doing it the right way. All those things. But in 1770, nobody was doing it. Not even our relatives, which is part of the challenge. So, why not? What about Locke? Locke writes before 1776. So then you might be thinking, because I know some of you are very knowledgeable about history. Well, certainly Locke had already written first and second treatises, the two treatises. He had. Well, clearly Locke was well known. No, he wasn't. Not really. Doesn't mean he didn't write it. He did write it. And remember, Locke is connected to the change in British history at the point of the 17th century. So from the death of Queen Elizabeth all the way through the Glorious Revolution, you've got this churn happening in England. And one of the two debate points that are going on is, how should the government be set up? So again, that sense of that, remember I said Anglo-American history, so the great crisis is happening there. That's their 80-year span. And what's being debated is, well, what kind of system should we have? And so what's coming out of that, which I'll look at more in a minute, is this idea of more citizens. Locke gets connected to the leader of really the original political party, particularly from a European Western civilization point of view. And that is Earl of Shaftesbury, who was in charge of the group that becomes known as the Whigs. And in short order, the Whigs basically were opposed to what they perceived to be an accumulation of power in the government by the monarchs, the two brothers, Charles II, who's on the throne, and his brother, James II. And so they argue that point. And eventually they get in trouble, and Shaftesbury has to flee for his life. He'll die in exile. Not in exile, but he'll die in the Netherlands, not in England. Locke goes with him and stays there until the Glorious Revolution. He starts writing two treatises in 1680, and it's really, if you read the first one, it's connected to an opposition to accumulation of power in a government. And then the second one is him laying out why he would suggest a different type of government. And of course, the government he ends up supporting is one that we would call a constitutional monarchy. And it is significant in kind of the human history, and we need to applaud kind of the British in their journey, because they had moved to this place where they were the first coming out of the Renaissance to really say, could we include people in decision making? It's at a very limited level. Even at the time of our revolution, 1765 to 76, you would have like whole counties in England who had like 7 voters. And so we're like, well, that's not very much political, letting people be involved in the process. But of course, you've heard Locke before, you know this story, and so we're not going to belabor the point here. But in his mind, this is important. The human is naturally good. The human already has natural rights that come from God. They never come from government. And so in the state of nature, everything's groovy. However, the state of nature is complicated and it's inconvenient. And so Locke writes, as do others with him in the Enlightenment later, post-Locke, that they will decide to then organize out of the state of nature. The word phrase state of nature is really important for us because when people were looking at the United States or the future United States living in the 1600s and into the 1700s, there was a generalized sense of they are actually getting to practice life in the state of nature, meaning in a pristine environment with no previously established rules. You and I know, of course, there were millions of people already here who did have established rules. But from a European perspective, they weren't thinking about that. So again, just kind of note that and move on. And so in this, government's established, he's arguing. And again, so that's Locke. So we go, yeah, so that predates Jefferson and Franklin saying these things are self-evident. But nobody really knew them. The one reason is because in England, nobody argued the point. Because everybody had accepted it. Even those who had initially supported the king, once he fled to France, they eventually get the nickname the Tory, the Tories party. You still hear that phrase a lot sometimes, even today, talking about today's modern conservative party in England. They'll say Tory, even though they don't call themselves the Tories. But basically, they're the party who say, the king's fine, we can leave it as it is. But even they came in, they go, yeah, Parliament's probably where you should do it. The king should be somewhat bound by Parliament. So that phrase, king in Parliament, monarch in Parliament, was their system. Okay, groovy. But other than that, nobody really thought about it. And so, even again, as we're writing in 1776, most people, this is the point, most people would not have known. Okay, so then what do I suggest are the unique items for us? It's this, and we're going to walk through these for the rest of our time together, kind of charging along through here. So we'll elaborate them as we go. So the first one does come from our relatives. We get that from them. So we honor the British for having helped us with that, and that is the government is of or from the people. Those are actually two separate words, And if you really dig into it and go deep in your kind of thought linguistically, government of the people and government from the people are saying two slightly different things. But for our purposes, we're going to kind of just combine them together because they're often used in a synonym type of way. So you say, okay, we have the government, and what we mean by it, we all know. Who's making decisions? Well, we are. And then we often, in modern times, misstate that by using the D word to describe our system. And I'll come back to that later. Some of you have been here before, you know exactly what I'm saying. Now, where's this come from? Why do we do this? Why did the British colonies or colonists living in North America set up a system that then in 1776, in its first government, become one expressed as government of the people? Why did they do that? Well, because of that glorious revolution that we just talked about. Now, again, what is that? When the Restoration happened in 1660, men like Shaftesbury supported the coming back of the king, mostly because they were unhappy with where the Commonwealth had gone. The first attempt by any people since Rome fell, the Republic fell, to try to do a government of/for the people. But quickly, as Hobbes points out, it becomes a dictatorship, basically. Not so much under Cromwell, but under his son Richard. Okay? So they get the king back, they're happy. And he says he'll accept some things, but between 1660 and 1680, it had gone sour for a variety of reasons, which I think are instructive. But in any case, eventually, leaders of the opposition, people who thought the king was asking too much power, there's also the issue of religion in the story, which is very important if you study British history. We should do that talk someday here. They're like, well, we're unhappy with the direction of where this is going. So they looked for a close relative, and they had one in the daughter of James, Mary, who was married to a dude named William, hence William and Mary. And William and Mary get invited to come as co-regents. William comes first with the army, but there's nobody to fight. This is why it's also known as the Bloodless Revolution, because the sitting king ran for his life. Interestingly, there wasn't a good reason for him to run. Had he stayed and thrown up the banner and said, this is my kingdom, my country, and you're invading, easily half, if not even up to 60% of the nobility would have stood with him. But once he ran, they're like, oh, okay, I guess we're not going to do that. And so into that story then comes a very famous document called the Declaration of Rights. So it's read initially. They take a year, basically from January all the way through December to work this sucker out. And eventually, William and Mary will sign off and go, yep, we agree with this. If you Google this, you can also find that under English Bill of Rights or even the English Constitution, the British Constitution, it's not. It's the Declaration of Rights connected to the Welsh Revolution, but it has never been supplanted. The British people have never sat down and said, hey, let's write a constitution like other nations have. They've worked on a system where the laws and ideas sort of build up. Okay, that's a whole different conversation. But just in general terms for us, this is where Locke's writings really come up and they become important. Think about the time. 1660 to 1680. Jamestown, 1608, 1607, 08. Pilgrims, 1620. Puritans, 1630. Catholics in St. Mary's, 1640s. Then post-Restoration, you have this flood of people coming. The Carolinas get set up. We win some battles and we take the New Netherlands away from the Dutch and we rename it after James, who's the Duke of York. And we took all the land around it. So we took the Delaware from the Swedes. So we have all this land we've connected eventually in the early 18th century. We'll throw our last colony up in Georgia as a place to let some people who could work off their debt, basically. We always talk about it being a place for prisoners, but it's basically people who are trying to work off debt. And so we have all these colonies happening in the time period of the creation of detention, then the writing of the Declaration of Rights, and then post that writing. So we should then recognize that the 13, and actually at that point there are like 15 or 16 colonies, depends on whose evidence you look at to count. Florida was a part of the system at that point. Won't be for long, but it was. They all were setting themselves up in their colonies around these ideas. And again, I stress for you how unique these ideas were. And so then that leads you and me to then recognize, wait a minute, you mean in 1776, we rebelled against the most radical, liberal country on the planet. Nobody was doing what the British were doing. Nobody. And then we were doing it, and then in 1760s, we're like, yeah, we can do it better. And whether that's fair or not, that's not the point. So then that leads you and me to ask some questions about what they structure. Again, we'll get back to this later, some not today, and then some later in the rest of the year. But so it's really telling, and I think most of us have forgotten that. Again, we think, oh, of course the American Revolution was self-evident, and of course any normal person would have agreed to it. And then we also fall prey to the misinformation that somehow the British King George III was a tyrant. It wasn't. That somehow there was a dictatorial takeover of the country. There wasn't. Again, most of the things in the Declaration, if you read them, all but two you can prove are false, and Jefferson's just flat out wrong. But nonetheless, that's what we believe. We're like, man, we can go further. That's how unique this was. So they set this thing up to say, hey, the individual has some rights. So what are these rights? When you read this is, again, from the Declaration of Rights from England. You should go, man, a lot of these are very familiar. A lot of these feel quite, where have I heard these before? And then you'll recognize some of them from our Bill of Rights, some things from statements, and then other things that you've just heard people in the ether kind of talk about, different kinds of conversations. So now you know where they all come from. But again, even though we have these as our foundation and our backdrop, we were saying they're not good enough. Or certain versions of things appear, like for instance, this one, jury trials, right? What we began to argue in the 1760s is, hey, we would blame the king, it was always Parliament. Hey, king, you've forgotten this exists. If you remember, for instance, after the Boston Tea Party, one of the things that happened was they said, hey, look, we can't trust people in Boston, so they're not going to have fair trials for these terrorists who have attacked the king's property, so we need to have these trials somewhere else, which makes logical sense unless you were an American at the time. And then what did it sound like? It sounded like the king was trying to remove from you the ability to have a trial by jury of your peers. Does that make sense? Can you see it? Okay, so we're saying, wait a minute, you're messing up here and not doing some things. So as we're setting up our colonies, we are consistently structuring societies that allowed us to express variations on government of the people. One of the ways I tell my students, you say, well, why didn't England go further when they did it? It's like, well, they didn't know what it was like. Why has Iraq had its trouble post our freeing them of Saddam Hussein circa 2007 or so? Why has it been a struggle for them? Well, there's various reasons, but it's not somehow the Iraqi people are lesser than us or are somehow incapable. It's that we had over 160 years of practice. We had basically government on the people on training wheels. Because technically, all of our colonies became and eventually led by the monarch. We became royal colonies. But where's the king? 3,000 miles away. So what influence is he having? None. And early in the 1700s, basically, England was like, we ain't got time for all that. Louis XIV's on the throne. They're fighting a whole series of wars that I call the Second 100 Years' War. We got bigger fish to fry than to worry about what Virginia may or may not be doing in their government. Because ultimately they're small, it doesn't matter. If we need to do something, we will. So we call this a period of salutary neglect, meaning what? The Americans were able to practice and experiment in a variety of ways of doing government of the people de facto without a king. Not de jure, but de facto, no king. Then in the 1760s, after the war, we won the last major war with France at that point, and the British government got more involved in saying, hey, we need some help financially, we need to kind of pay more attention to what's happening here. We perceived it as invasive and oppressive. And so we were saying, we want to keep doing the thing we're doing now, which is government without a king. So we set this up. And we did do that. And so when you look at the Constitution and you look at what forget the Constitution, when you look at our first governing document in 1776, and you look at the Declaration, what you clearly see are these expressions of we need a government of the people. And they were thinking again singularly of the people. Well, okay, next. Well, how do we know that could work? Well, it only works if the individual has liberty. And again, I'm reminding you, go back to the 1770s when nobody knows this. You imagine you've never heard this phrase. You personally never had liberty in your life ever. And now I'm saying to you, we could set up a government in which you have liberty. You'd be like, what are you talking about? And the best way to describe it, and we won't go into too much depth here, is to remind you that at this point, everybody else who were like the colonists were largely peasants in the feudal system. Now, across Europe, by this point, the feudal system is in decline, but the ideology, you see this really well, and my mind's totally blank on the TV show. What was the TV show?
Downton Abbey.
Thank you. You see it very well in Downton Abbey. It's set in the late 1800s into the early 20th century. But what is it? It's a very rich family that owns all the land. There's a little village. I remember one episode, there's like a pig farmer who dies, and then they're thinking that the family's going to get, and the girl goes to see the Crowley family, and they're like, my family's been the pig farmer for the Crowleys for 200 years. We don't want to lose our job. Meaning, did they own that house? No. Was that their job? No. Did they have any right to be on that land? No, this is the early 20th century. Vast majority of people had no liberty of the individual. But if you're going to have a government of the people, those people have to have a liberty of that. Now, the best way to kind of describe it is you can see in some of these things here. I mean, day before yesterday, I got in my car without asking anybody's permission. I drove on government roads without having to pass any checkpoints or show any paperwork. I parked in 2 parking lots that I do not own without asking anybody's permission or giving them any identification. I drove, for as far as you know, if you were driving with me, without any proof that I know how to operate the vehicle. And if you came up behind me, you could see that there was some sort of a government thing on my car, but you had no idea if that was legit or not. And not a soul asked me. When I walked into Publix, I wasn't stopped. Whoa. Who are you? Why are you here? I'd like to shop, please. We have to check and see if we want you to shop or not. I just waltzed in like I owned the place. And then, when I was done gathering my goods, I just marched my little self right up to the checkout, put my stuff down, and gave them a piece of plastic. I didn't even give them anything of worth. That plastic, melted down, can't be worth 2 pennies. And they let me walk out with everything. It was almost like shoplifting. I didn't give them a thing. That is the liberty of individuals that previously people did not have. Now, had I stuck something in, having then broken the law, having operated without the law, public could come after me. If I posted something on my device that was libelous about somebody, say I spoke evilly about my college, the college would have the right to come after me within the confines of the law, but they would not have the ability to silence me from writing what I want to write. Does that make sense? This is huge. And again, I would say to you, even today, we as citizens of the United States ought to say to ourselves, this is not, every place on the planet today does not have this. But you have to have liberty of the individual in order to have government of the people. Does that make sense? Government of the people, liberty of the individual, but the individual must have a virtue. This is that spiritual thing that we don't want to talk about. Meaning, again, think about it for a second. We'll come back to this again in a minute. What's the alternative? Not government of the people, but in other words, I just described a whole bunch of activities that I did. Well, you would have to have the force of government present everywhere. Right? And that is the system. You go other places, or, and sadly, tragically, in our hemisphere, poor Haiti is going through this right now. When you don't have any government, you have chaos. Right? So either we have a system by which some all-powerful entity dictates our every move, or we have a government of the people in which we conclude together what we want to say is appropriate and not appropriate. Think of all the stop signs you see, or think of the idea of having a school mile-per-hour zone. You should think of those things as things that we, the citizens, have chosen. Even if you go, why technically didn't get to vote on it? Well, actually you did, because you voted for somebody to be in a position of authority. But that's still representative of your voice. And if you thought, those school zones, they're way too long. They're way too long. But then you have the right as a citizen to go to the people in charge and demand that they shrink them or speed them up or something. You'll lose, hopefully. And then if the person blows you off, what will you do? You will work to get them voted out of office. So somebody gets voted into office that speaks with your voice that the school zones are far too long or too slow. Do you see that? But if you don't have that virtue, then you're left with this other setting in which somebody needs to have a cop at every stop sign. And his job will be basically to shoot the tires out or shoot you if you don't stop out of fear. See, the idea of virtue in the individual is that you stop at a stop sign not because of something about the civic law, but because you love your neighbor. And you recognize that it is in my neighbor's best interest for me to care for them to the point that at a place where we've agreed as a society that a stop sign goes, I should stop. And then there's also the benefit for me that I won't face some kind of financial penalty or have myself come to self-physical harm by having just capriciously gone on. But in a system that we set up, you never stop because you're afraid of the government, because the government's us. Does that make sense? It's quite beautiful, but it's only, can you see how it's dependent only on a virtue? You can't have it, you can't just hope people will be nice, because as Hobbes said, they're not. And that includes Carl. So something has to be built into the system. And so this idea comes out most in John Adams' writing, but he is not alone. So Adams is thinking about this, and he starts talking about the fact, this is my favorite quotes of his, the preservation of liberty, so liberty of the individual, depends upon what? The intelligent and moral character of the people. As long as knowledge, think of that as education, and virtue are diffused generally among the body of a nation, it is impossible they should be enslaved. His version of enslavement is this idea of not having the liberty. And then here, 70-75. Virtue alone is or can be the foundation of our new governments. He is not alone. Washington, farewell address. Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In other words, it won't work if we don't have a morality and a virtue that is uniformly agreed to at the foundational level. What would happen if we lose it? Well, Franklin most famously described it when he was there writing at the Constitution, and he gives a long speech. Actually, he has somebody else read it because he's on his last dying days, actually. And he describes how I think the Constitution will be great. It's going to work. It's pretty good. However, and he goes, it'll last for a while. But then he says, it'll die out, basically, when the people shall become so corrupted. What's corrupted? Opposite of virtue. When the people become so corrupted, what? That'll fall apart in anarchy? Oh, no. In despotic government. Think of the word tyranny. We would use the word dictatorship. They didn't have that word then. They didn't use it that way. So Franklin's looking ahead going, man, this is bad. Adams, back to Adams. He says, look, with the loss of liberty, the failure of our system can only happen by debasing their understandings. So what I tell you, my whole point of the podcast is to say, we've forgotten our history, people. Please listen. Please listen. Oh, I wish if you agreed with me, you would go tell 10 people, listen to this podcast. I think it's that worthy. That's self-serving. I understand. Please forgive me. But I'm just saying, there is a sense of a passion for the country to say to people, Adams was right. And having lost our understanding, or, he goes on, or by corrupting their hearts. Same thing as Franklin. Our system's unique because it's governed of the people, by the people, from the people. It's a government based on the liberty of individuals. And it's a government based on virtue. If you don't have the virtue, you can't make the whole thing work. Okay. Fourth. Nobody was saying no government. Now that's Rousseau's argument. Rousseau in his best, and people like to say, well, Rousseau was a champion for democracy. No. Rousseau is a champion for anarchy. And anarchy is it's a type of governing system. It's taking Locke to his extreme that says, if the human is good, we need no government. And Locke would have been like, yeah, that's going a little far, Jean-Jacques, sorry. A little much there. So that's Rousseau. But nobody agreed with Rousseau. At some level, Rousseau didn't agree with Rousseau. And so nobody's channeling him in America at this time. So they realize you're going to have some government. And what does government have? We use the word power to best explain it, but it has responsibility. It has agency. It has activity. I just described two things to you. Before you can legally operate a motor vehicle, you have to prove you can operate a motor vehicle, and you go to some place and take a test. We may think it's silly. We may think they don't do a good job. We may think that it takes too long to wait there. But nonetheless, unless you want to run afoul of the system, and then you really get in trouble, you go and you do it. And you have a little car. And then, every year, you pay a tax on your vehicle. Which, by the way, the founders would be aghast. They'd be like, what? Did you buy that yourself? Yes, I did. Do you own it? Well, the bank kind of owns it, but yeah, I'm owning it. Then you shouldn't have to pay a tax to anybody. And we have reasons. We argue the point with our founders as to why we think having a license tag is a good idea. The other point is I want you to see that they're going, wait a minute, why do we have to do this? Well, because you give the government agency. So then the point was, what made it unique set up was for them to say, the amount of agency, the amount of responsibility must be small or limited. Now this may be, of all the things in this list of 6, the one that is the most challenging for us. I teach modern U.S. history. I know what happened in the early 20th century. And there are reasons why, even as I argue for the founders, I find myself conflicted because there's aspects of our life together. You know, you and I live with 3 million people-ish here in Central Florida. It's very difficult to imagine that working well without a more expanded government having more agency or responsibility. So don't hear me suggesting we should strip our government down to where they were with the founders. I'm just pointing out what made it unique. And so this is this idea that if you have a system that's not individual only, you will set up a government, and in setting up the government, it will have responsibility and agency that they called power. So Adams is the first of the Americans to really think this out and flesh this out. And he's writing very early. It's his mind's kind of connected to it, but then his opportunities really provide him this moment where he can kind of dig into it. We've done a whole talk here on John Adams. You go to my website, you can find it, watch the whole thing. But he's kind of thinking in these terms. And early in 76, he's asked by several other representatives, hey, could you write down some of the ideas you've been talking about here in Philadelphia about government? Because we're going to go back to our individual colonies, hopefully soon to become states, and write constitutions. So he does, and it's this document here called Thoughts on Government. And so in Thoughts on Government, he'll flesh this out 2-3 years later when he basically singularly writes, it's still continuous to this day. It's the longest active living state colony. Actually, it predates our U.S. Constitution, obviously. That's continuous. And John basically writes the whole thing himself, so he puts all of his ideas in practice. And then nearly a decade later, when he's our ambassador in England, he wants to defend our structure, this unique structure, so he writes this last document, a defense of the constitutions. And he's kind of laying out his system, and again, it starts with this idea that there must be a split of the power. The power must be limited. And he's looking at the best way to do this, to limit the power. And you limit the power with a mixed government because this allows for laws, not... He says men. Think of it as a republic is an empire of laws, not of individual humans. So again, he's kind of pushing back against Rousseau. He's actually pushing back against democracy, which he, agreeing with Montesquieu, thinks is a terrible system. Madison thought it was a terrible system. We've covered that ground before, so we're not going to get into it now. That's the D word that I mentioned earlier. So this idea of having the government limited in its agency becomes important. Because if the humans have these opportunities, then they should be allowed to do most things themselves. There's also an aspect of the governance being structured coming down, right? So we think of a centralized, overarching government of the civic system. Then you break it down into smaller units of some kind. We call those states and then counties and then cities. And so if you do that and you structure it this way, each has only a select amount of power. But here's the key, in this idea of limited power, I'm not saying it's what we do now or it would even work now, but what we do, but the idea is that your power, if you're on the top level, if you're a governor over a state, your power does not reach into the power of the county or the city. So your power is a specific things for the state. And then that's the end of it. Limited power, limited responsibilities. Does that make sense? I'll make sure I'm being clear for you guys. Well, what about other things? Oh, that belongs to the county. So for us, Orange County. But do they have everything? No, they don't have everything. They don't have the things the state has, but they also don't have the things Winter Park has. Winter Park has its own things. So you can see then what that means is the different agencies, we would call them governments, have different types of responsibilities or agencies that they get to express, but they can run up to the end of I want to do this other thing. Well, that's not in your purview. You don't get to do that. And because government is of the people, and the people have liberty, and they have a virtue, if you're the person in charge, you'd say, oh, okay, you're right. If in your mind you immediately thought of at least one example, there's probably 20, where you're like, that's not what that person did. Now you can begin to see part of the challenge that we're in. Okay. Limited responsibility, weakened, but also divided. So then not only did they say, we want a system in which there is limited things they can do, but even in the entity, so now let's only focus now on, say, the centralized national government, but it would be true even at the city level, whatever level you want to break it down to. They believed, and they put into practice, that you had to take that pie. So I've used a circle kind of metaphorically, you kind of see it. There's a circle that's that responsibility or that group's agency, right? Can you all see it in your head? Now we got to split it. So now it's not only, if I'm the guy in charge, I can't walk out of the circle. I can't walk out of my quadrant. There's a circle that we're all in here, but now there's like 3 other people in here. And I can't go over to her quadrant. That's her quadrant. She's responsible for that. I don't have responsibility for that. Does that make sense? This is brilliant, and the reason that it was brilliant was because of this idea that Adams and Montesquieu recognized that where power exists, it will accumulate. We know this in another way. Bureaucracies exist to self-perpetuate. And many of you, like me, I love Valencia, but it's a bureaucracy, multi-layered, and boy, I've been there 22 years, and it's easy to bring in new things, and it's nigh impossible to get rid of something. Why? Because bureaucracy self-perpetuates. Bureaucracy is not exactly the same as saying power, but it's almost a near synonym. Power will always accumulate. So these guys are thinking, we don't want that to happen. So how do we do that? Well, you split the main powers of government apart. It is Montesquieu who kind of takes us there first in 48. And it seems pretty clear that Adams is leaning on Montesquieu, or at least in deep agreement with Montesquieu in his writings. And so Montesquieu's writing, we'll come back to this when we do the Enlightenment, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. But when we do the Enlightenment next month. But in general terms, what Montesquieu is saying, what I was just saying, that power will accumulate, and you have to divide it up. And you're dividing it up, just so you're aware, in a way that makes the quadrants, use the phrase I just used, the metaphor, combative. Now, I'm not saying that, so remember when they wrote this, there's no political parties in the United States. There are groupings. They typically called them factions. And they typically said they were terrible, but they all basically, except for Adams and Washington, got involved with them. So there's this sense of groupings. They said, had you said, what if all of the apparatuses of the government were part of the same grouping? I think most of them would have been worried. But even if they were part of the same grouping, it was their intent that they work against each other, or at least provide what we call a check against them. You can tell how much we've lost this because we typically think of Congress as one entity. It's not. It's bicameral on purpose. And the structure as set up and philosophically was that they would often disagree to the point of not getting things done. Now listen to your fellow Americans over at least the past 20 years, although I'd argue this has been at least for the past 70 years. Why can't Congress get stuff done? That's how far we've lost our way, because we want Congress to do more things. And the founders would have been horrified for the central government to think it can or should do more things. They would say, do the things you have responsibility for. Yes, we're counting on that. But the more things, don't do those things. Does that make sense? And when you hear people expressing their frustration and how long things can take, what they're really hinting to you and me is either how much they don't know, or worse, how much they wish they did live in the power pyramid structure. Because in the power pyramid structure, things get done really quickly. Because I'm Napoleon, I can just do it. And if you don't argue with me, I'm Stalin, and I can just kill you. And then nobody has to hear you anymore, and things got done, and everybody's happy because I do good things. We have a better education system, we have a better postal system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. See, this is the allure of this situation. It'd be easy if it was like, our way's amazing, and that way's like eating mud. It's not. And when you look at, say, life under Octavian in the first decades of the Roman Empire, or you look at life in the first 3 decades under Louis XIV after the Fronde, or you look at life under Elizabeth I, you go, man, it was amazing to live there. It'd have been better to live under the dictatorship of Octavian than to live in the previous 3 decades of the dying embers of the Republic. It was a nightmare in the Republic. Just as far as like your personal safety, your economic ability, your sense of the structure, the infrastructure of our society, you'd say, oh man, it's so much better. So we're not saying that kind of power pyramid, or to use Franklin's term, a despotic setting, is by nature evil. Like we'd all go, oh, this is evil, we need to quit. Because things get done. So when you say things don't get done, I want you to go, but wait, that's the way the founders wanted it. Why? Because they didn't want the government to do things. Why did the government not have a standing army? Because armies are an auspices of their ability to project power. Why were there no police forces? I love police forces. I'm glad we have them today, and I'm happy to pay my taxes for them and firefighters. But when you say, well, why didn't they have them before? Were they just stupid? They didn't think of it in the early American system? No, because they didn't believe that they needed them. That's the why. And what is the police force? The police force is an agency of the government. When you get a ticket, it's not Fred or Sue who gives you the ticket. It's the state of Florida or the city of Winter Park that gives you the ticket. That person is just the agent of the government. They're anonymous. Does that make sense? Why wasn't the government early on allowed to have more access to money, particularly through taxing? Because money is how things are getting done, and the founders are like, no, we don't want them to have that ability to get there. The guys who wrote the Constitution, and again, we'll do Constitution later this year. We're going to dig into it. They knew that they were making a move from Locke towards Hobbes, and they wanted to give more agency or responsibility to the central government than it had previously had. We'll have that conversation then. But again, they're not disagreeing. I don't want you to think Madison is at odds with Adams or Hamilton is at odds with Adams and Montesquieu. They're not. Because their whole structure, again, was to set this up with the divided power. So they did it intentionally to allow things to settle. Last one, and that is the idea that from our colonization, there are some what I call our founding themes. We're going to do a whole day later this year, our colonization. And when we do, we'll go into depth on this. But just to point this out to you, it is my observation that when you look at the founding of the United States, these four themes permeate in a way that are unique to us. My observation for you today is that we have these unique structures that are important for us. And here they are again, that I would suggest to you we are imperiled in losing, and if we don't know them and don't understand them, then we potentially make group decisions that will be harmful to the future success of the entity. Again, allowing you the freedom to go, oh, I want the country to change. Okay, that's great. I'm not arguing that you can't think that way. Let's conclude, just real brief. Just these last thoughts here. Kind of already said all these, so I'm going to wrap it up here. In all of our colonies, we did a mixed government of types. They're different types. They were unique. They're different kinds. So again, that was a way for them to kind of experiment. So when they came together in Philadelphia, they were coming with different experiences. Some had a unicameral, some had a group setting, not a single executive, some had no executive. So they had these different ways of thinking about it. They didn't all have an independent judiciary. Adams is really one of the first to say the judiciary needs to be independent. Montesquieu says the same thing. So they're kind of pushing this out. And so then what I would want for us to do is to cherish these things. To note how uniquely situated, unique, not perfect, not good, I'm not saying that. Uniquely situated the structure was of the society. And certainly, as I just alluded to, relative to living in a big city in the 20th century, not 21st century, things have changed. And so then as we, as the citizens involved, have to think through, based on these 6, and there may be more, others may come up with more, unique statuses, but the world has changed. How do we think about these things now? And then that would be our collective job as citizens to kind of have that debate. But I will stress yet again that I think this has not been lost. This is not wrong, what the founders said. Without the moral virtue foundation, the civic structure cannot hold. And our current kind of the crisis moment of the pattern is not just that we're debating whether or not what type of civic government is for best for most people. That's the thing that all of the crisis moments have done. But that for the first time, we're actually debating the worldview upon which the system sits on. Previously, as Lincoln argued in his second inaugural address. We're all praying to the same God, we all have the same ideas, we're fighting some stuff out, right? Now, our current one is that we are fighting about whether there is a worldview that we can stand on, or what do we do if there's multiple foundations? I would suggest the civic system can't stand. I'll try to prove more of that as the year goes by and other moments. I really appreciate you guys being here. I'll take questions if you have them. Thank you so much for being so attentive. Do we do the class once a month? We do. It's always on the second weekend, but next one, because of something that the library is doing, is on February the 1st. It's okay if you don't. I hope you have a pleasant afternoon. Anybody have a question? I want to leave you hanging, give you the opportunity. I'm going to show you the slide again to where you can find my YouTube channel. Yes?
Carl, to be provocative.
Do it.
So, ruled by the people, governed by the people, starts off from a democracy point of view of everybody's involved, everybody in the community is part of that decision-making process. But that clearly wasn't the situation in 1776. A small minority had power, had influence.
Yep.
And so you still had this pyramid of power here as much as anywhere else. It may not have a king in it.
What's the question?
Well, I'm trying to say, do you really think it is different?
Okay, so the question was, or the statement was, that clearly at the time, so I want to correct one thing, right? And I'm going to push on this, and this is my stance, and I'm not giving it up. Never say we were a democracy or that we were striving to be a democracy. So the point was, clearly in 1776 or 1800, all the people did not vote on all the issues. And that's correct. They could not have. Again, a democracy is where not some, every decision is made by all the people all the time. There's never a decision made by anybody not you. So if you say to yourself, well, that's not what we do, then great. Quit saying we're a democracy. We're not. We're a very good thing. Just go, again, maybe we need to do this one again. Go look at Athens and go look at Rome, and you recognize I cannot say democracy and republic are synonyms. They simply are not. They're in the same family, government of the people, but they're different. So because we weren't a democracy, the point is, good question, aren't we still doing a power pyramid? I would argue no. By means, feel free to disagree, because everybody who has a hand on the lever is there singularly because we chose to put them there. And that's the whole point of the republic system. The republic is designed, and again, who are we picking? We're not picking people from another nation. We're not picking people from another world. We're picking of the people. That's the whole system, that it's designed to pick of the people. One of you could be the next governor. One of you could be the next mayor. And you'd say, I'm one of you. They all should now, I would say in 2025, we could say to ourselves, I rarely think any of the elected officials are one of us. So then now we have a problem, because if we're claiming government of the people, but they don't seem to be of us, there you see the issue. But in the time period it's structured as they structured it, nobody else was doing it that way, where they were saying the individuals could be chosen by anybody. Anybody could. Now, we limited it only to men, I would say, unfortunately, because we lost the opportunity of having people like Abigail or her two sisters who were as brilliant as her, or Mercy Otis Warren, who would be brilliant herself also as a leader, governor, president. So we limited ourselves from having the full expression of our citizenry. But still, nobody was taking that stance and then giving the responsibility into their hands. And I would also add to that an aspect of what they were doing was that they believed that they could remove anybody at any time, which they did. And not all, but some of them, they had it set up so that that person would have to face a restatement to the citizens. Hey, I want to do it again. And then there would be a chance for the citizens to still speak again. We've learned in the 19th and in the 20th century, which is again part of the issues, that the law, the kind of rule of incumbency has made that problematic. And I would suggest if you and I get to go to Mars and set up a new system, we better take that into account, because there seems to be a problem with that right there. Yes, go ahead.
So do you think term limits on the congressional level
So the question is, would I think term limits would be helpful? I would say absolutely in our current setting, because we've lost the ability to understand that no one should be in government forever. If you'd asked the founders, they would have been shocked for any. Now, Madison is one of the first to kind of break the system. And then you get other people, Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams. I mean, he's in government forever, his whole life. And so early on, they begin to have aberrations to their beliefs. But if you talk to them at founding, they would have assumed we don't need term limits because nobody in their right mind would want to do it for more than maybe 2 years at best. And when you study what the senators did, up until we stupidly changed the Constitution to allow them to be voted on by the people, the average term limit of a senator was like 8.5 years. Because the system was set up to, if anybody got cocky and thought he, or soon she, could be there forever, the state would say, oh, no, come home. But once we put it in the hands of the voters, the senator's average term limit, I think it's like 22 years or 23 years. So basically the adult lifespan. It's a disaster because of the thing. It may not be a disaster in another system, but in this system that we're talking about, it's a disaster. There's a question up here. Yes, sir.
You read Percival Everett's James?
Say it again.
Have you read Percival Everett's James?
Have I read Percival Everett's James? No, I have not. I'd love to know about it.
It has a discussion with Locke. James Huckleberry Finn's Jim has a discussion with Locke.
What's the name of the book? Do you know the name of the book?
James.
James.
It's terrific, and you should read it.
Thank you.
It's terrific.
Thank you. Who's the author again?
Percival Everett.
Okay. Percival Everett is the author. The book is called James. So we're all going to go quickly and find it on Amazon and check it out. You know, it's good. That's why I love you guys. We want to have collective thinking together. Appreciate you guys. If I can be of any help, there's my email. If you want to get back to the podcast, you can do it here. The other thing was the YouTube. Have a great day, everybody. Appreciate you.
Thank you.